Schorfheide Forest, Brandenburg, Germany. April 28, 1945. Dawn. Hermann Göring gives the order. Blow it. Explosives rigged throughout the structure. The detonators armed. Göring is 60 miles away, heading south toward Bavaria with a convoy of trucks. The trucks carry paintings, sculptures, tapestries, over 1,500 pieces of art, crated, packed, evacuated. The Red Army is 48 hours away, maybe less. Soviet tanks rolling west from Poland. The Third Reich collapsing, Berlin surrounded, Hitler trapped in his bunker, and Göring's palace must not fall intact to the Soviets. The explosions echo across the lakes. Grosser Donsee, Wookersee. The forest animals scatter. The structure collapses section by section. The Grand Gallery, 34 meters long, built specifically to display stolen art, demolished. The hunting lodge, Swedish-style timber, where it all began in 1933, destroyed. The crypt where Carin's body had lain for 11 years, obliterated. This is Carinhall, named in memory of his Swedish first wife, Hermann Göring, 1888 to 1931. The residence was constructed in stages from 1933 on a large scale. In 1945, the collection included over 2,000 individual pieces, including more than 300 paintings, approximately 50% of which was property confiscated from the enemies of the Reich. 50%. Over 1,000 pieces. Stolen. Lohse helped supervise the systematic theft of at least 22,000 paintings and art objects in France, most of which were taken from Jewish families. And that was just France. Belgium, Netherlands, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia. The looting extended across occupied Europe. The numbers don't tell you what Carinhall was really defending. Not culture, not beauty. Stolen culture, looted beauty. Art taken from families being deported to death camps. Paintings seized from collectors murdered in gas chambers. A monument to theft built on genocide. If you enjoy investigations into the dark histories behind Nazi architecture and the stolen art that filled it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which site to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The story begins not with Hermann Göring, but with a woman who died before the Third Reich even came to power, a Swedish aristocrat whose memory became the excuse for building a palace of plunder. Let's begin. Born Carin Axelina Hulda Falk on 21 October 1888 into a minor Swedish aristocratic family, she married Göring in 1923 after divorcing her first husband, Nils von Kantzow. Carin Falk, Swedish, minor nobility. She met Hermann Göring in 1920 in Sweden. He was a pilot, a war hero from World War I, an early member of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party. Carin died of heart failure on 17/10/1931, 4 days prior to her 43rd birthday. Carin died on 17 October 1931 at age 42 from complications related to tuberculosis and heart disease, initially buried at Lovo churchyard near Stockholm. October 17, 1931. Hermann Göring was 38. Her husband, Hermann, was too busy with the NSDAP and didn't sit at her bed when Carin died. He was not present when she died. He was occupied with Nazi Party business, with Hitler's political machinations, with the work of seizing power in Germany. Carin was buried in Sweden. When Göring visited the grave in October 1933 and put a wreath in the form of a swastika on the graveside was destroyed. Göring visited the grave in October 1933, 2 years after her death. He placed a wreath shaped like a swastika on the grave. Local Swedes were outraged. They vandalized the grave. The gravestone with a swastika engraved was now engraved with the text, "We the Swedish are insult by the desecration of tombs by the German Göring. Let his former wife rest in peace." Sweden wanted nothing to do with Nazi symbols desecrating their cemeteries. Göring's response was to remove Carin from Sweden entirely. But first, he needed a place to bring her. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's earliest and most loyal supporters, was appointed Minister-President of Prussia, making him one of the most powerful men in the new regime. When Hermann Göring was appointed Minister-President of Prussia in 1933, the Schorfheide fell under his jurisdiction. The Schorfheide, a vast forest north of Berlin, protected hunting grounds dating back to Prussian kings. The estate functioned as the core of an expansive hunting preserve within the Schorfheide forest, where Hermann Göring, appointed Reichsjägermeister in 1933, imposed stringent game management policies. Reichsjägermeister, Reich Hunting Master. Göring gave himself this title. He controlled all hunting in Germany, appointed himself protector of the forests, established wildlife reserves. This was not environmental concern. This was power, control over who could hunt, where, when. The forests were Göring's domain. As Hitler's de facto second man, Göring was on the lookout for an appropriate abode, and it was no coincidence that he set his eyes on the Jagdschloss Hubertusstock. Jagdschloss Hubertusstock, a hunting lodge that had belonged to Kaiser Wilhelm II. Göring wanted it. It was a symbol of the old aristocratic ruling class. Kaiser Wilhelm refused. The lodge stayed closed to Göring. So Göring found new land. Göring found a nice new plot of land in Schorfheide next to the Großdöllner Sea. As his luck would have it, the Prussian state handed over 120 hectares to fulfill his ambitions, for free, of course, and for life. 120 hectares, free, for life. The Prussian state, which Göring controlled as minister-president, gave him the land, gave himself the land. No payment, no lease. Outright gift from the state to the state official. In June 1933, Göring commissioned the architect Werner Mark to build a Swedish-style hunting lodge. Werner Mark, the architect who would later design Berlin's Olympic Stadium. Mark was given instructions: build a Swedish-style timber lodge. Why Swedish? Because Carin was Swedish. The lodge was to be her memorial. In the spring of 1934, Göring moved into his newly built Swedish-style blockhouse. This wasn't an ordinary blockhouse, of course. This was a two-story, 230-square-meter wooden palace. The interior was naturally decked out lavishly, along with a large painting of his first dead wife, Carin. 230 square meters, 2 stories, timber construction in Swedish style. The interior was lavish. Carved wood, hunting trophies, a large portrait of Carin dominating one wall. The name Carinhall probably has 2 origins. Carin comes from Carin von Konsau, born Fock. She had met Göring in Sweden in 1920, and they fell in love with each other. Carin came to be a supporter of the Nazi movement over the years, but she never got to see Hitler come to power because she died in October 1931, just a few days before her 43rd birthday. The word hall that followed Carin probably comes from the Nordic mythology Valhall, which according to mythology is the place where the fallen warriors come after death. Carinhall, Carin's hall, Valhalla, the hall of fallen heroes in Norse mythology. Göring was positioning himself as a Germanic warrior, connecting his estate to ancient mythology, claiming a lineage that reached back beyond Christianity to pagan gods. Göring also had a crypt built for his first wife, Carin, who had died of tuberculosis in 1931 in her native Sweden. A crypt, on the grounds. And in June 1934, Carin's body was brought from Sweden. June 19, 1934. The funeral procession. Carin Göring's remains had first been interred in Sweden following her death, but were moved to Carinhall in 1934 and placed in a crypt on the grounds. This was not a quiet reburial. This was spectacle. Hitler and Göring head Carin Göring's funeral procession at Carinhall, 19 June 1934. Adolf Hitler himself attended, the Führer, present at the funeral of Hermann Göring's dead wife, walking alongside Göring in the procession. Nazi officials, SS officers, military leaders, thousands in attendance. This was a state funeral for a woman who had died 3 years earlier, whose only qualification for such honor was being Hermann Göring's first wife. Carin's coffin was placed in the crypt, the mausoleum built specifically for her, and Carinhall became not just Göring's estate, but Carin's shrine. Despite always trying to portray himself as a man of the common people, he soon gated off his realm and ordered all curious visitors to stay away. He even went so far as to forbid map-makers from mentioning the place. The estate was removed from maps, guards patrolled the perimeter, access was by invitation only. This was Göring's private domain, hidden from the public, secret. Hitler approved the funding for the lavish estate in return for having Göring take over the task of hosting state guests and foreign dignitaries. This was the arrangement. Hitler funded Carinhall. In return, Göring would entertain diplomats, host foreign visitors, wine and dine dignitaries away from Berlin. Carinhall became an unofficial center of Nazi diplomacy. On 10 April 1935, Carinhall was the venue for Göring's wedding banquet with his second wife, Emmy Sonnemann. April 10, 1935, Göring remarried Emmy Sonnemann, an actress. The wedding banquet was held at Carinhall. Emmy moved into the estate and Carin's crypt remained on the grounds, the new wife living alongside the dead wife's tomb. But by 1935, the original lodge was already insufficient. Göring's ambitions had grown, his wealth had grown, and most importantly, his art collection had begun to accumulate. He needed more space. In 1937, Carinhall expanded, and the original lodge was built into the new. It consisted of 2 wings, a main building and a courtyard. 1936 to 1937, massive expansion. In 1936, he conceived the plan to convert his hunting lodge in the Schorfheide region north of Berlin into a country house called the Waldhof Carinhall. The original timber lodge was incorporated into a much larger complex, stone wings, a courtyard, new buildings. There, he had a 34-meter-long hall built called the Grand Gallery, where he exhibited the most important pieces of his collection. 34 meters. The Grand Gallery. This was the heart of the expansion, a hall built specifically to display art. What art? Initially, Göring financed his passion for collecting visual art with gifts from industrialists in exchange for a favor of friends. Gifts from industrialists. This is a euphemism. Industrialists gave Hermann Göring paintings in exchange for favorable treatment, for contracts, for protection, for survival. This was not generosity, this was tribute paid to power. To his daughter Etta, born 1938, he built a castle in miniature. Emmy bore Göring a daughter in 1938, Etta. For her, Göring built a miniature castle on the Carinhall grounds, a playhouse scaled to a child, complete with turrets and battlements. In 1940, Carinhall was expanded once again, and plans were made to expand it further after the war and make it a museum, Hermann Göring Museum, to open in 1953 on Göring's 60th birthday. A permanent monument to Göring's glory, filled with art, open to select visitors, proclaiming Göring's status as patron and collector. When Göring received guests at Carinhall, they were treated like princes while letting them understand who was number 2 after Hitler. The entertainment at Carinhall was elaborate. The guests could either spend the day down in one of the bathhouses that Göring had built by the lake, or they could play tennis, table tennis, gym exercise, or watch movies in the cinema. Bathhouses by the lakes, tennis courts, gymnasium, cinema. Göring also had a gigantic railway model in the attic, which at the time was supposed to have been the largest in the world. A model railway, the largest in the world. Göring was 50 years old, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, and he had a toy train set. But what was perhaps the highlight for the guests was when Göring arranged large hunting parties. Göring had appointed himself the self-made title Reich National Hunter and participated in several hunting parties.
Göring had implanted deer in the area in order to hunt. Hunting parties. Göring stocked the forest with deer specifically to be hunted by himself and his guests. The pet lion cubs that Göring had also attracted a great deal of interest. When they became adults, they were placed in the Berlin Zoo and replaced with new puppies. Lion cubs as pets. Göring kept exotic animals at Carinhall, showing them to guests, then donating them to the Berlin Zoo when they became too large and dangerous. The halls of Carinhall were adorned by one grand hunting trophy after another. Every wall displayed animal heads, antlers, skins. The estate was designed to proclaim Göring's identity as hunter, as master of nature, as Germanic warrior. But hunting trophies were secondary. The art was primary. During the war, Göring came to decorate Carinhall with looted art objects from large parts of Europe. When the Japanese foreign minister Matsuoka visited Carinhall in 1941, he got the impression that it was more like a museum than a home. A museum, not a home. The paintings covering every wall, the sculptures in every room, the tapestries, the furniture, the ceramics, thousands of pieces. And where did they come from?
September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. By September 21st, 1939, the Nazis favored classical portraits and landscapes by old masters, particularly those of Germanic origin. Nazi art policy was clear. Old masters were valuable. German art was superior. Modern art was degenerate and should be destroyed or sold. The systematic dispossession of Jewish people and the transfer of their homes, businesses, artworks, financial assets, musical instruments, books, and even home furnishings to the Reich was an integral component of the Holocaust. This was not incidental. This was policy. As Jews were arrested, deported, murdered, their property was seized. Everything. Homes, businesses, bank accounts, art collections. In every country controlled by Nazis, Jews were stripped of their assets through a wide array of mechanisms and Nazi looting organizations. The primary organization was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR. Having joined the SS in 1933, Lohse became a member of the Nazi Party in 1937. He would eventually be drafted into Göring's Luftwaffe, then appointed by Göring to the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, Hitler's special art looting unit. The ERR was Hitler's official art looting agency. Its mission? Seize art from Jewish families, from museums, from occupied territories, sort it, catalog it, ship it to Germany. And Hermann Göring had his own representative within the ERR. Bruno Lohse was a German art dealer and SS Hauptsturmführer, who during World War II became the chief art looter in Paris for Hermann Göring. Bruno Lohse, born 1911. Lohse, who published a scholarly thesis on the painter Jakob Philipp Hackert in 1936, worked as an art dealer in Berlin from 1936 to 1939, selling paintings out of his father's home. He had a doctorate in art history. He wrote academic papers. He was educated, cultured, fluent in French. He joined the SS in 1933, age 22. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937. Though Lohse reported to Paris ERR chief Kurt von Baer, he enjoyed special agent status conferred on him by Göring. Special agent status. Lohse reported officially to Kurt von Baer, the head of the ERR in Paris, but in practice Lohse worked for Göring. Among other privileges, Lohse was not required to wear a uniform for the nearly 4 years he lived in occupied Paris. Lohse lived in Paris from 1940 to 1944. No uniform required. This was extraordinary. SS officers wore uniforms, but Lohse didn't. Göring wanted him to blend in, to move through Parisian art circles as a dealer, not as an occupying soldier.
As a tall, young, athletic SS officer with fluent French and a doctorate in art history, Bruno Lohse captured Hermann Göring's attention during one of his visits to the Jeu de Paume art gallery in Paris, where the Reichsmarshal would quaff champagne and select paintings looted from French Jews. The Jeu de Paume, a museum in Paris. The ERR used it as a depot, a sorting center for stolen art. A depot was set up by the Reichsleiter Rosenberg Task Force, ERR, in the Jeu de Paume in Paris to receive these works. Over 4 years, it saw the delivery of more than 21,900 artworks. 21,900 artworks delivered to the Jeu de Paume, stolen from French Jewish families, catalogued, photographed, sorted. The art would then be transported by Göring's private train to his country estate outside Berlin. Göring visited Paris regularly. He would arrive at the Jeu de Paume, walk through the galleries where looted paintings hung temporarily, select the ones he wanted, and have them crated and shipped to Carinhall via his private train. Lohse became Göring's agent in Paris, charged with helping Adolf Hitler's No. 2 to amass his vast store of stolen art.
As the ERR's deputy director in Paris from 1942 to 1944, Lohse helped supervise the systematic theft of at least 22,000 paintings and art objects in France, most of which were taken from Jewish families. 22,000 in France alone, most from Jewish families. Families being arrested, deported, murdered. Between November 1940 and November 1942, Lohse staged 20 exhibitions of looted art for Hitler's second-in-command in the Jeu de Paume, from which Göring selected at least 594 pieces for his own collection. 20 exhibitions, private viewings, for Hermann Göring. Lohse curated them, selected the best pieces, arranged them in the galleries. Göring would arrive, champagne in hand, walk through, point at paintings, that one, that one, that one. 594 pieces. That's just from the Jeu de Paume exhibitions. That's just what Lohse staged. Göring acquired art from other sources as well. In addition to about 700 works of art that Göring grabbed from the Nazi looting organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, Göring also deployed his own organization, the Devi-Schutzkommando, in the occupied territories to confiscate art on his behalf. 700 from the ERR, plus hundreds more from his own organization, plus gifts from industrialists, plus forced sales. The U.S. National Archives and Records Administration's Consolidated Interrogation Report No. 2 states that Göring never crudely looted. Instead, he always managed to find a way of giving at least the appearance of honesty by a token payment or promise thereof to the confiscation authorities. The appearance of honesty. Göring paid token amounts for paintings worth millions. This was theft disguised as purchase. I'm paying you 1,000 Reichmarks for your Rembrandt. That makes it legal. Or, you can sell me your collection voluntarily, or you can be arrested and we'll take it anyway. Göring had Goudsticker employee Ari Tenbroek a legally appointed agent of the Goudsticker Company. Then on 13 July 1940, Tenbroek sold to Göring all the art held by the company as of 26 June. Göring bought all 1,113 of the inventoried paintings and artifacts for 2 million guilders, valued at 13,750,000 euros on 2005, not more than 1/6 of their actual value. 1/6 of actual value. This was the Goudsticker collection. Jacques Goudsticker was a major art dealer in Amsterdam. He fled when Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940. He died in an accident while escaping. His collection remained. Göring forced a sale through a puppet agent, 1,113 pieces for 2 million guilders, a fraction of their worth. This pattern repeated across Europe. Identify valuable collections, arrest the owners or force them to flee, seize the art, pay nothing or pay token amounts, ship to Germany, display at Carinhall. By 1945, Carinhall contained an extraordinary collection. At the end of the war, Göring's personal collection included 1,375 paintings, many sculptures,
carpets, furniture, and other artifacts. 1,375 paintings, plus sculptures, tapestries, furniture, ceramics, antiquities. In 1945, the collection included over 2,000 individual pieces, including more than 300 paintings. The exact numbers vary depending on the source. Over 2,000 pieces, certainly, possibly more. The collection was so vast that even careful catalogs couldn't track everything. It is estimated that at least half of these artworks were obtained through Nazi looting efforts. Half, over 1,000 pieces, stolen. What did the collection contain? Old masters, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Van Dyck, Renaissance paintings, Baroque works, Flemish portraits, Dutch landscapes, German altarpieces. It was at Carinhall that he kept the greater part of his enormous art collection. The Grand Gallery, 34 meters long, walls covered floor to ceiling with paintings. The main hall displaying sculptures. The smaller rooms filled with tapestries, furniture, ceramics. Visitors to Carinhall walked through rooms where every object was priceless, where every painting had been owned by someone else, where beauty had been stolen from families being murdered. Sarah Wildman, writing in The New Yorker, described Göring's inventory as a twisted treasure map, a guide to looting and pillaging and gift-giving among the Nazi brass, and a tracking mechanism for the Nazi occupation of Europe. A treasure map. Every piece in the collection had a history, a provenance, a former owner. Many of those owners were dead, killed in Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, murdered specifically because they were Jewish. And their art was at Carinhall on Göring's walls, displayed as his collection.
The mechanics of the looting were systematic. This entire operation of plunder, said historian Jonathan Petropoulos, was carried out with industrial efficiency. Industrial efficiency. The Nazis applied factory methods to theft. Identify targets, seize property, catalog, transport, distribute. The Parisian museum Jeu de Paume was used to warehouse artworks seized from French Jews. Göring visited it about 20 times between 1941 and 1944 to select artworks of especially high quality that had been picked out especially for him. 20 visits. Göring flew to Paris, spent hours at the Jeu de Paume, selecting art, then flew back to Germany. Lohse arranged everything. The paintings Göring wanted were crated, loaded onto his private train, shipped to Carinhall. The book describes in meticulous detail how this dashing SS officer, living a life of luxury with a chauffeur-driven car in Paris, organized 18 exhibitions of looted art for Göring at the Jeu de Paume, helped him commandeer more than 700 paintings from the ERR, and acquired many more from other dubious sources. 18 or 20 exhibitions, sources vary slightly, but the process was consistent. Lohse would receive word that Göring was visiting. He would select the finest pieces recently acquired, arrange them in the galleries, ensure champagne was available, and greet Göring when he arrived. Modern art, denigrated as degenerate, was legally banned by the Nazis from entering Germany. Artworks designated as such were held in what was called the Martyrs' Room at the Jeu de Paume. The Nazis hated modern art. Picasso, Matisse, Kandinsky, all degenerate. But these works had market value. So Lohse arranged exchanges. Lohse, who's a good problem solver, realizes that with some of the collaborationist dealers, that if he could exchange the modern degenerate art, he could obtain other works from them that are desired by Göring and other Nazi leaders. When you look closely at the exchanges, they are very lopsided. You might have, an old master painting, and it's being exchanged for, say, a dozen looted Impressionist paintings, which apparently are of much lesser value. But actually, that's not the case. The exchanges were fraudulent. One old master painting for 12 Impressionist paintings. The Impressionists were worth far more, but the Nazis classified them as degenerate and undervalued them deliberately.
Collaborationist dealers in France, Switzerland, and elsewhere profited immensely. They then go on to be sold for much higher values, whether it's in France or it's in Norway or it's in Switzerland, and the dealers do extremely well out of that. A black market in stolen art operating openly under Nazi occupation with Lohse at the center, ensuring Göring received the pieces he wanted while degenerate art was sold to generate cash for the regime.
Who actually owned the art before it was stolen? Families, collectors, dealers, museums, people who had spent lifetimes assembling collections, who had inherited pieces from parents and grandparents, who loved art and lived surrounded by beauty. Jacques Goudsticker, major Dutch art dealer, fled the Netherlands in May 1940, died in an accident during the escape. His collection, over 1,100 pieces, seized by Göring. The Rothschild family, banking dynasty, Jewish, multiple branches across Europe. Their collections in Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, looted systematically. Lohse fled Paris in August 1944 and briefly served in one of Göring's safe Berlin regiments before traveling to Neuschwanstein Castle in February 1945, where a major cache of art looted in France, as well as the Rothschild family jewels, had been safely stored. The Rothschild jewels, stored at Neuschwanstein Castle along with paintings, sculptures, tapestries. Gottfried Behrmann Fischer, Jewish publisher in Vienna. His collection included a Pissarro, Le Quai Malaquais Printemps, 1903, a painting by Camille Pissarro that the Jewish family from whom it had been looted in Vienna had been trying to trace for 70 years. 70 years. After the war, Behrmann Fischer's heirs searched for that Pissarro. It had been at Carinhall. After Carinhall was destroyed, it disappeared into private collections, resurfacing decades later. Henri Rothschild, doctor, philanthropist, art collector. His Paris mansion was looted in 1940. Furniture, paintings, decorative objects shipped to Germany. Some went to Göring, some went to Hitler, some went to other Nazi leaders. These were not anonymous victims. These were people with names, families, lives, and they were being murdered while their art was being hung on Göring's walls. After 1943, most visitors were evacuated children and wounded soldiers who were billeted in tents around the grounds. By 1943, the war was turning against Germany. The Eastern Front collapsed after Stalingrad. Allied bombing intensified. The tide shifted. Carinhall began to change. The lavish entertaining stopped. The hunting parties ended. Instead, evacuated children and wounded soldiers were housed in tents on the grounds. Göring's power was waning. Having proved unsuccessful at building adequate air defenses to protect Berlin from Allied bombing and the home territory in general, his standing with Hitler and the German public severely declined after 1942. The Luftwaffe, which Göring commanded, failed to defend Germany from Allied bombers. Cities burned, civilians died. Göring's reputation collapsed. But Carinhall remained, and the art remained, over 2,000 pieces. By 1944, it was clear Germany would lose. As the Red Army advanced on Berlin in April 1945, Göring had most of the structure demolished. This likely was not only to prevent its capture by the Soviets, but also to keep Berlin safe from the advancing Soviet forces. Wait, that last sentence doesn't make sense. Let me correct. But by early 1945, the war was nearly lost, and Hermann Göring did not want Russian troops to get hold of Carinhall. He gave orders to evacuate the artworks from the estate and then blow up the buildings. That's better. Göring didn't want the Soviets capturing Carinhall intact. He didn't want them taking the art, discovering the records, understanding the scale of the looting. The artworks from Carinhall were packed in 24 trucks. 24 trucks, over 1,500 pieces evacuated. Göring was heading south to Bavaria, to Berchtesgaden, trying to escape the Soviet advance. The art went with him. The house was blown up in late April 1945 by a special Wehrmacht team led by Kurt Bayer. April 28, 1945.
In April 1945, the Red Army was moving towards Berlin, and to take away the joy of taking Carinhall from the Russians, he gave the demolition team free hands to blow up the buildings. Kurt Bayer, Wehrmacht officer, led the demolition team, explosives rigged throughout Carinhall, the Grand Gallery, the hunting lodge, Carin's crypt, everything. Göring had also ordered that Carin's body be dug up and brought to Neuhaus, south of Munich. Even in the final days, even as Germany collapsed, Göring had Carin's body exhumed from the crypt and transported south. He wouldn't leave her for the Russians. The artworks from Carinhall were packed in 24 trucks. However, before Hermann Göring and his convoy could leave Berlin, American troops intercepted them. The trucks were intercepted. American forces stopped Göring's convoy. They found the artworks looted from all over Europe and impounded them. Many of the stolen artworks were returned to their countries of origin shortly after the war. From there, they were supposed to be returned to their legal owners, but that would prove to be a painstaking task. A painstaking task, because many of the owners were dead, murdered in concentration camps, their heirs scattered across continents, if they survived at all. Proving ownership required documentation that had been destroyed, identifying which painting belonged to which family when records were incomplete or falsified. At the end of the war, during the Summer of Restitution in 1945, half of the artworks recovered in Germany and Austria was returned to France. The rest lingered. Half returned quickly. The rest lingered in storage, in legal disputes, in museums' collections marked Provenance Unknown.
Göring was captured by American forces on 9 May 1945 and indicted on charges of crimes against humanity, among other charges, in the Nuremberg trials. Hermann Göring, arrested, tried. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death, but committed suicide the night before he was to be hanged. October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell. He denied the Allies the satisfaction of hanging him. Bruno Lohse survived the war. He was tried at the Nuremberg trials, but managed to avoid conviction, despite a U.S. military court in December 1945 finding him guilty of looting and sentencing him to 10 years in jail. After being imprisoned for 2 years, Lohse's wartime crimes fell under a different jurisdiction, and he was released. 2 years in prison, then released. After his release from prison, Lohse worked as an art dealer in Munich until 2007. He returned to the art trade, worked as a dealer in Munich for 60 years. He died age 95 in his Munich apartment on 19 March 2007, having amassed a fortune estimated at more than $150 million. $150 million. Lohse lived comfortably until age 95. His fortune came from art dealing. Whether any of that fortune derived from art he'd helped loot was never proven conclusively. He lived on prosperously until 2007, allegedly facilitating the sale of looted artworks and amassing a personal collection worth at least $150 million. Allegedly. Lohse was investigated multiple times after the war. Investigators found that, in addition to art and valuables stashed in his apartment, he also had a secret apartment in Zurich and a Swiss bank account under another name. Swiss bank accounts, secret apartments, art stashed away, but he was never convicted of post-war crimes. He died a wealthy man.
What remains of Carinhall? Today, there are still remains of Carinhall. However, it is not so much. Only the entrance gates remain, foundations and blocks of stone. Ruins. The entrance gates, stone pillars marking where the driveway entered the estate. Foundations overgrown with trees and brush. Scattered blocks of stone, remnants of walls. Since 1998, the site has faced challenges related to neo-Nazi interest, with authorities monitoring and occasionally restricting access to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for extremists. Neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. This is the concern. Carinhall was Hermann Göring's estate. For neo-Nazis, that makes it sacred ground.
Far-right extremists occasionally visit the ruins to commemorate Göring. Authorities debate what to do. Local authorities have debated whether to develop the site as a memorial to victims or to let it remain unmarked to avoid drawing neo-Nazi attention. Develop it as a memorial, but a memorial to whom? The art's original owners, murdered Jews whose collections were stolen, or a memorial to the looting itself, explaining what happened here? Or leave it unmarked, let the forest reclaim it, let Carinhall fade completely. The local state government has ruled out constructing an information board at the site, due to fears it could become a pilgrimage site for right-wing extremists, and in January 2007 said that the complete removal of the ruins is being considered. Complete removal. Bulldoze what remains. Erase the site entirely. But is that solving the problem or hiding history? Some historians say that the site must be preserved and made into a place of remembrance as a reminder of Nazi art robbery. Preserve it as a reminder. Document what happened here. Explain the looting. Name the victims. Turn Carinhall's ruins into education. But others argue that preserving the ruins gives neo-Nazis a focal point, a place to gather, a site they can mythologize. Others say that the area should not be preserved to prevent neo-Nazis from seeing the place as a place of pilgrimage. As of now, the ruins remain, overgrown, technically accessible but remote, no signs, no information boards, no tourists, just forest, lakes, and scattered stones.
What does Carinhall reveal about the relationship between beauty and theft, between culture and genocide? First, that looting art was not incidental to the Holocaust. It was integral. The systematic dispossession of Jewish people and the transfer of their homes, businesses, artworks, financial assets, musical instruments, books, and even home furnishings to the Reich was an integral component of the Holocaust. Integral. The theft of property funded the Nazi war machine. Seizing Jewish bank accounts, businesses, real estate, this generated revenue. But seizing art served a different purpose. Cultural domination, proclaiming that German culture was superior, that Germanic taste would determine what art survived. The Nazis stole art because art represented civilization. By seizing it, they claimed ownership of European culture. By displaying it in places like Carinhall, they proclaimed that Germany, not France, not Italy, not the Netherlands, was the rightful heir to European artistic tradition. Second, that collectors like Göring could separate aesthetic appreciation from moral horror. Göring loved art. He spent hours studying paintings, discussing techniques, learning provenance. He hired experts like Bruno Lohse, who had doctorates in art history. He built a 34-meter gallery specifically to display his collection properly. This was not Philistinism. This was genuine appreciation for beauty. And simultaneously, he was looting from families being murdered in gas chambers. These two facts coexisted in Göring's mind without apparent conflict. He could admire a Vermeer in the morning and sign deportation orders in the afternoon. The art was beautiful. The Jews were enemies. Both could be true to him. This reveals something uncomfortable. Aesthetic taste doesn't correlate with moral character. A person can love beauty and commit atrocities. Art doesn't make you good. Third, that the post-war reckoning with looted art has been incomplete. At the end of the war, during the Summer of Restitution in 1945, about half of the artworks recovered in Germany and Austria was returned to France. The rest lingered. Half returned quickly. The other half still being litigated 75 years later. Le Quai Malaqua, Printemps, 1903, a painting by Camille Pissarro that the Jewish family from whom it had been looted in Vienna had been trying to trace for 70 years. 70 years, and that's just one painting. Thousands more remain lost or in disputed ownership. Why has restitution been so slow? Because many owners are dead, because heirs are scattered globally, because documentation was destroyed, because legal systems prioritize current possessors over dispossessed families, because museums don't want to give up valuable works, because dealers profited from looted art and don't want to return pieces. The art survived.
Justice hasn't.
The mechanics of Carinhall's construction and operation mirrored Nazi ideology. As his luck would have it, the Prussian state handed over 120 hectares to fulfill his ambitions, for free, of course, and for life. Free land, no payment, just taken from the state, which Göring controlled, and given to Göring personally. This was corruption normalized, the blurring of public and private, the idea that powerful Nazi officials deserved estates because of their service to the Reich. Hitler approved the funding for the lavish estate in return for having Göring take over the task of hosting state guests and foreign dignitaries. State funds paid for Göring's private palace. The justification, Göring would entertain diplomats there. But Carinhall was Göring's property, not the state's. He lived there. His family lived there. The estate was his, funded by German taxpayers. Despite always trying to portray himself as a man of the common people, he soon gated off his realm and ordered all curious visitors to stay away. He even went so far as to forbid map-makers from mentioning the place. Hidden from the public, removed from maps, guards preventing access, this was not a people's palace. This was Göring's private domain, built with public money, filled with stolen art, closed to Germans except those Göring personally invited. The Nazi regime preached Volksgemeinschaft, national community, shared sacrifice, but the reality was hierarchy, privilege, plunder, concentrated at the top. Carinhall embodied that hypocrisy.
The question that haunts Carinhall's ruins: can you separate art from how it was acquired? If a painting is beautiful, does it matter that it was stolen? If a Rembrandt hanging on your wall once belonged to a Jewish family murdered at Auschwitz, does knowing that change how you see the painting? Museums worldwide grapple with this. They hold works acquired during 1933-1945 with unclear provenance. Sometimes heirs come forward claiming ownership. Sometimes the museum investigates and discovers the work was looted. Then what? Some museums return works voluntarily. During the Summer of Restitution in 1945, about half of the artworks recovered in Germany and Austria was returned to France. But that was immediate post-war restitution, relatively straightforward because governments forced it. 75 years later, museums fight restitution claims. They argue the current owner bought in good faith. They didn't know it was stolen. Too much time has passed. The legal claim is weak. Heirs argue theft is theft. No amount of time makes stolen property legitimate. Museums have a moral obligation to return looted art, even if legal requirements are unclear. The law varies by country. Some nations have statutes of limitations after which stolen property claims expire. Some don't. Some place the burden of proof on claimants to prove theft. Some place it on possessors to prove legitimate acquisition. Carinhall contained over 1,000 stolen pieces. Those pieces scattered after 1945. Some went to museums, some to private collectors, some disappeared into black markets. 75 years later, how many have been returned to rightful heirs? A fraction. How many remain in collections marked provenance unclear? Unknown. How many were destroyed? Unknown. The art Göring stole outlasted him, but so did the injustice.
Bruno Lohse's post-war life reveals the failure of denazification. After his release from prison, Lohse worked as an art dealer in Munich until 2007. He resumed his career. He lived in Munich openly. He dealt in art. He accumulated a fortune. He lived on prosperously until 2007, allegedly facilitating the sale of looted artworks and amassing a personal collection worth at least $150 million. Allegedly, because it was never proven conclusively in court. But investigators suspected that Lohse continued profiting from looted art for decades. Investigators found that in addition to art and valuables stashed in his apartment, he also had a secret apartment in Zurich and a Swiss bank account under another name.
Swiss bank accounts under false names, secret apartments, art hidden away. This was not the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. Lohse has told conflicting stories about the cash throughout his life, even denying its existence. He lied. When investigators asked about hidden art, he denied it existed. When confronted with evidence, he changed his story. When pressed on specific pieces, he claimed he'd forgotten, or that records were lost, or that he'd acted on behalf of others. After his death in 2007, German officials raided Lohse's apartment and his niece's apartment and discovered a treasure trove of artworks. After his death, German officials raided his Munich apartment and found art he'd never declared. They raided his niece's apartment and found more, paintings stashed in closets, stored in attics, hidden for decades. And there are at least a half-dozen works there that have really problematic histories. Problematic, looted, stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust, paintings that should have been returned 70 years ago, still hidden, still in Lohse's possession even after his death. You know, there is this painting by Franz Marc called Die Füchse, and it was part of Alfred Flechtheim's collection. Flechtheim was a Jewish gallery owner who died essentially in exile. Die Füchse, The Foxes, by Franz Marc, German expressionist, from Alfred Flechtheim's gallery. Flechtheim was Jewish, fled Germany, died in poverty in exile. His gallery's collection was seized, and 70 years later, one of those paintings was in Bruno Lohse's apartment. Why wasn't Lohse prosecuted again after this discovery? Because he was dead. You can't prosecute a corpse. The paintings were eventually seized, and some have been returned to heirs. But Lohse lived prosperously until 95, profiting from theft for 60 years after the war ended. The system failed.
The servants and workers at Carinhall are absent from most histories. Carinhall required staff, cooks, housemaids, groundskeepers, guards, drivers. The estate was large, 120 hectares. The main buildings were extensive, 43 rooms at minimum, possibly more after expansions. Tennis courts, cinema, bathhouses, the miniature castle for Edda. Someone maintained all of this. Someone cleaned, someone cooked, someone kept the gardens, someone guarded the gates. Their names are mostly lost. They weren't committing crimes, so they weren't tried at Nuremberg. They weren't important enough to Nazi leadership to be documented in detail. They were just employees working for Göring because he paid wages. Some probably knew about the stolen art. They cleaned the rooms where paintings hung. They packed crates when pieces were moved. They saw the trucks arriving from Paris, the crates being unloaded, the paintings being uncrated and hung. Did they know the paintings were stolen? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they assumed Göring bought them legally. Maybe they suspected but couldn't ask questions. Maybe they knew and didn't care because their job was to work, not to judge. When Carinhall was demolished in April 1945, what happened to the staff? They were dismissed, presumably. The estate was being destroyed. There was nothing left to maintain. They scattered, found new work if they could, disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Their labor made Carinhall function. Their silence protected Göring's reputation while he lived, and their stories are erased from history.
So what remains of Carinhall, beyond scattered stones? The art survives, scattered across museums and private collections. At the end of the war, Göring's personal collection included 1,375 paintings, many sculptures, carpets, furniture, and other artifacts. 1,375 paintings. Most recovered by Allied forces in 1945. Many returned to countries of origin. Some returned to families. Some lingered in legal disputes for decades. The records survive. Nazi bureaucracy was meticulous. The ERR cataloged everything. Over 4 years, it saw the delivery of more than 21,900 artworks. Those catalogs exist in archives. Photographs of Göring selecting paintings at the Jeu de Paume exist. Shipping manifests exist. Invoices for forced sales exist. The evidence is overwhelming and well documented.
This is not contested history. This is fact. The lawsuits survive. Families still fighting for restitution 75 years later. A painting by Camille Pissarro that the Jewish family from whom it had been looted in Vienna had been trying to trace for 70 years. 70 years, and ongoing. The precedents survive. Carinhall is not unique. Göring's collection was enormous, but he wasn't the only Nazi leader who looted art. Hitler had a collection. Ribbentrop had a collection. Goebbels had a collection. The pattern repeated across Nazi leadership. And the lesson survives. Beautiful things can be built on atrocity. Monuments to culture can be monuments to theft. Aesthetic sophistication doesn't prevent moral horror.
So what do you build when your wealth comes from theft, when your palace is filled with beauty stolen from the murdered? Hermann Göring built Carinhall, a Swedish-style hunting lodge expanded into a vast complex, 120 hectares, bathhouses, tennis courts, cinema, miniature castle, a grand gallery 34 meters long specifically to display art. He built it for Carin, his dead first wife, her body in the crypt, her portrait on the wall, the estate named after her memory. And he filled it with stolen paintings, over 1,000 pieces taken from Jewish families being murdered, Vermeer from Amsterdam, Pissarro from Vienna, Rembrandt from Paris, a collection assembled through forced sales, token payments, outright seizure. When the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka visited Carinhall in 1941, he got the impression that it was more like a museum than a home. A museum, not a home. Every wall covered with paintings, every room displaying sculptures, beautiful, priceless, stolen. Göring planned to turn Carinhall into a permanent museum after the war. Plans were made to expand it further after the war and make it a museum, Hermann Göring Museum, equipped with art in all its forms and would be ready just in time for Göring's 60th birthday, 1953. The Hermann Göring Museum, his monument, his legacy, proclaiming his status as patron, collector, guardian of European culture. But Germany lost. The Red Army advanced, and Göring ordered Carinhall destroyed rather than let it fall to the Soviets. In April 1945, the Red Army was moving towards Berlin, and to take away the joy of taking Carinhall from the Russians, he gave the demolition team free hands to blow up the buildings. He evacuated the art first, 24 trucks, 1,500 pieces, trying to save what he'd stolen. The art was intercepted, the paintings recovered. Göring was captured, tried, convicted, sentenced to death. He killed himself before execution. And Carinhall was rubble. Carinhall's ruins lie today in the Schorfheide forest, overgrown, unmarked, contested. Today, there are still remains of Carinhall. However, it is not so much. Only the entrance gates remain, foundations and blocks of stone. The entrance gates, stone pillars, scattered foundations, blocks of stone half buried in earth, trees growing through what were once walls, lakes nearby, peaceful, beautiful. Far-right extremists occasionally visit the ruins to commemorate Göring. Neo-Nazis, making pilgrimage, seeing Carinhall as sacred ground, Hermann Göring's estate, a place to honor a Nazi leader. Since 1998, the site has faced challenges related to neo-Nazi interest, with authorities monitoring and occasionally restricting access to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for extremists. Authorities debate: preserve the ruins, destroy them completely, build a memorial, leave it unmarked. Every option has consequences. Preserve it and neo-Nazis gain a focal point. Destroy it and you erase physical evidence of Nazi looting. Build a memorial and you might legitimize or draw more attention. Leave it unmarked and the history fades. There is no good answer. What we know, Carinhall was built with state funds given to Göring for free. It was expanded to house stolen art. It contained over 1,000 pieces looted from Jewish families.
It was destroyed by Göring's own order rather than let it fall to the Red Army, and 75 years later, its ruins remain contested. The art Göring stole is scattered across the world. Museums hold pieces with unclear provenance. Families still fight for restitution. Bruno Lohse lived prosperously until 2007, possibly profiting from looted art his entire life. The cultural theft that built Carinhall's collection was not a side effect of the Holocaust. It was integral. Seizing art was part of destroying Jewish communities, erasing their presence, transferring their culture to Germanic hands.
Göring loved beauty. He studied art. He hired experts. He built a gallery to display his collection properly. And he filled that collection with paintings stolen from families being murdered. Both are true. The aesthetic appreciation was real, the theft was real, the genocide was real. Beauty doesn't redeem atrocity. Collecting doesn't erase murder. Art stolen from the dead remains stolen, no matter how beautiful, no matter how carefully displayed. Carinhall stood for 12 years, 1933 to 1945, built as a memorial to a dead woman, filled with art stolen from murdered families, destroyed by its owner rather than surrendered. Only ruins remain. The entrance gates still stand, stone pillars in a forest. The foundations outline where buildings once rose. Blocks of stone scattered in the undergrowth mark where walls once stood. And the forest reclaims it slowly. Trees grow through ruins. Moss covers stone. Rain erodes what explosives didn't destroy. Carinhall is becoming what it should have been from the beginning. Nothing. Just forest, lakes, and forgotten stones. The art survived in museums. The victims are remembered in memorials. The looting is documented in archives. But the palace built to celebrate the theft? Ruins. Overgrown. Contested. Fading. And perhaps that's justice. Not perfect justice. Perfect justice would have returned every stolen painting, prosecuted every thief, prevented the Holocaust entirely. But this justice, the monument to theft destroyed, the collector tried and convicted, the ruins left to decay, the forest reclaiming the land. Carinhall is gone. The memory remains. The lesson endures. You cannot build something beautiful on genocide and expect it to stand.